Now, this video will be the third part of my deep dive into the rise of Skywalker, and this time we'll be covering the character of Rey. And though it should go without saying, there are going to be major spoilers in this video, so if you haven't seen the movie yet, and you don't want it ruined, it's a good time to click away. Also, the point of this video is to overanalyze and nitpick, so if that's not your thing, this might not be the video for you. Okay, so I should probably start by briefly going over what I thought of this character heading into the rise of Skywalker, and honestly, I thought her introduction in The Force Awakens was handled quite well, almost perfectly in fact. That film does a great job of immediately showing us what her life is like and makes us feel for her, as we see that she's living alone on a harsh, hostile planet where every day is simply a struggle to survive. And we're really given the impression she can't rely on or trust anyone but herself. And as I've said before in other videos, I initially thought the idea behind Rey, or what her journey would be to struggle to find faith in something and or someone beyond herself, that it'd be hard for her to believe in the Force and the Jedi, and to resist the temptation of the selfish dark side, because she'd only survived for so long on Jakku, because she believed so strongly in herself and fended basically only for herself. Not saying she wouldn't have a heart of gold underneath it all, because as our main character of the trilogy, she obviously would, but it'd take a lot of chipping away to get to it, and plenty of mistakes would be made along the way. The back half of The Force Awakens is where things start to go wrong for the character of Rey. It's when we start to wonder more about where she came from, rather than where she's going. She's constantly doing things that really make us want to know what's the deal with her, why is she so powerful? Why is the Skywalker lightsaber not only calling out to her, but why does it choose her over an actual Skywalker at the end of the film? How can she do mind tricks if she thought the Force was a myth just yesterday? What's the deal with her closing her eyes and just letting the Force in? The movie heavily implies there's something very, very special about Rey, certainly much more to know about where she really comes from and who her parents are, even though she only ever mentions her family in the film, but it leaves the answers hanging at the end and then gives us 2 years to think about them before the next movie comes out. And since this is the Skywalker saga, this is the story of that family, the obvious and logical conclusion seems to be that she will somehow be directly related to that family. But then The Last Jedi tells us that she's nobody special. Kylo Ren even tells her she has no place in the story. We also see that she doesn't really need much actual training, nor does she need any type of personal reason to want to become a Jedi, even though, again, she thought they were a myth a couple days ago. She'll then randomly go to try to save someone she thinks or thought was a monster because she talked to them a couple times over the course of a few days and felt some sort of kinship. And in the end, she'll save everyone, barely getting a scratch in the process. And if you question anything about her, you must be a horrible person who can't stand women being in Star Wars. And oddly enough, this character didn't resonate with some fans. Essentially, The Last Jedi tries to tell us that Rey is interesting because she isn't interesting, because she's going to find her own place in the story just for the sake of it. And many people really love that about Episode 8, that it tells us that you don't have to come from any sort of special family or bloodline to be a Jedi, and I can only imagine those people skipped the prequels or haven't consumed any other Star Wars content. Because that's always been the case in Star Wars. There are no great, long-running bloodlines from which all Jedi come from, outside of the Skywalkers, which lasted 3 generations. Instead, Force-sensitive children are just randomly born throughout the galaxy, found, and then trained. Even Anakin Skywalker was just born, found, and trained. He didn't initially come from some sort of special bloodline, though obviously the circumstances around his birth were unique. Still, he was born to a random slave woman on Tatooine. He was picked by the Force to fulfill a purpose, just like The Last Jedi tells us Rey was picked by the Force for a purpose, to curb the rising dark side. And so I really don't understand the anger from some around the reveal of Rey being a Palpatine in The Rise of Skywalker. Now sure, there are a bunch of questions around it, like who exactly was her father? Was he even Force sensitive? And if so, why didn't Palpatine use him, or was Papa Palps not back from the dead yet? Does this confirm that the Force can indeed be passed down and that subsequent generations are just as powerful, if not more so, than previous ones? Or is it just a Skywalker and Palpatine thing? Anyway, making her a Palpatine doesn't ruin her story. It doesn't undo this idea that was not first introduced in The Last Jedi about how anyone can become a Jedi. What it does do is make Rey a part of the bigger story. It gives her some personal stakes in all of this, even if they do feel a bit rushed or forced here at the end. Because, like it or not, this is the Skywalker saga. This is or was all about them, and primarily about Anakin Skywalker as said by George Lucas himself. And though it's clumsily done, this last movie in the saga is about Rey rejecting her dark origins and choosing to be something better and to honor those who kinda trained her and were like a family to her, and thus she takes their name and carries on their legacy. Problem is, we have to kind of forget about the interactions between Rey and Luke in The Last Jedi, and we certainly have to forget about the way those two parted ways in that movie. At no point does Luke really intend to train Rey. He's just trying to do the opposite, in fact. He's trying to convince her not to be a Jedi. And though they both take something away from or learn something from their short time together, I don't know how or why Rey would see Luke as a father figure, and I don't know that a 1-minute scene in The Rise of Skywalker between the two makes up for that lost time between them. With Leia, on the other hand, at least it's implied there's been time and training between her and Rey, a reason for them to form a bond, and a reason for Rey to ultimately honor her. Problem is, because of the unfortunate and untimely passing of Carrie Fisher, the filmmakers could only repurpose previously filmed and unused footage of Leia to give us scenes of her and Rey together. And though it kinda works, you can certainly tell there's something a little bit off about Leia's scenes, but I suppose I'm willing to give them the benefit of the doubt here and appreciate the effort to give Leia a much-deserved role to play in the final film. Either way, and yes, I know a lot of people really didn't like it, but I didn't necessarily have a big problem with Rey taking the Skywalker name at the end of the movie. I just wish it had been set up far, far better, and that actual Skywalkers had a bigger part to play in the final defeat of Palpatine. Like maybe after Ben gets pushed off the cliff in the final confrontation, give me a scene of him laying semi-conscious somewhere, and then the Force ghost of Anakin appears before him, hands him his lightsaber saying, "This belongs to you now." It would tie right back into The Force Awakens when Kylo Ren initially said how it belonged to him then, and well now, he's actually earned the Skywalker saber. Then Ben and Rey kill Palpatine together, but Ben willingly takes the brunt of Palpatine's lightning and dies, but not before he gives Rey Anakin's lightsaber and asks her to carry on their legacy, to finish what they all started and to keep the Force in balance, or something like that. And sure, it's a bit cheesy, but I'd argue it's better than what we got, and it doesn't require any weird transference of life energy. Which means maybe we can just get rid of that forced and awkward scene where Rey randomly heals the injured serpent that just shows up and sits there for her to heal, because that scene ends up reeking so heavily of foreshadowing that it's ridiculous. Anyone who has seen a movie before knew that was blatantly setting up stuff later on, including the healing of Ben Solo after she stabbed him, which would have to be worked around if we remove that scene, though maybe she just leaves Ben to die and he finds a way to save himself. Anyway, I literally rolled my eyes when Rey said after healing the serpent that she'd just given him a little bit of her life force and rubbed at her hand, as if too much would be very detrimental to the donor, because you could bet your life that by the end of the movie, someone was going to be giving up a lot of life force for someone else and dying in the process. And look, whether or not force healing should be part of the canon, though it's been in the games as long as there's been Star Wars games, and it's seen in the EU multiple times. Anyway, whether or not it's good or bad for the new canon and makes sense, I think, is an interesting topic for a separate video, because this movie is not the only place it's shown up as of late. For now though, I'll say that I think it is a rather powerful ability, even though it was almost commonplace in games and the EU. And speaking of powerful abilities, the next question to address is, outside of that force healing, does Rey do anything else truly crazy powerful in this movie, which has been a complaint about her in the previous films? Well, at one point she does flip over Kylo Ren's fast-moving TIE fighter and severs off its wing and causes it to crash and explode, but I'd argue that maybe the craziest part about that scene is that Kylo Ren just walks away from it without a scratch. Rey then accidentally force lightnings and destroys a transport ship that she thinks Chewbacca is on, which is a bit much to accidentally do since that ability is kind of considered the strongest dark side force power there is. However, I guess you could argue, and it's likely their intent, to show us just how strong Rey could be with the dark side if she decided to fully embrace it. Plus, I think it was just a hint at the fact that she's a Palpatine, since lightning and palps are just synonymous with each other at this point. And speaking of lightning, I think the part that really seemed a bit much to me was at the end of the movie when Rey rather easily blocks Palpatine's force lightning that moments before was so powerful it could hit and basically disable the whole Resistance fleet above them. And then, yet again, Palpatine literally fries himself with his own lightning, this time to the point of incinerating himself, which makes one wonder why he never seems to learn. Why didn't he just stop and use some other sort of power on Rey like he had before, when he froze her and Kylo Ren in place? Also, does reflecting lightning back at someone not count as killing them? Is that why Palpatine couldn't possess Rey after he died? Or is it because all of the Jedi showed up and helped that we're to assume now that he died more permanently this way or for real this time? And on a side note here, what happened to the actual First Order? In the end, only the Sith fleet is destroyed. Isn't the First Order still out there ruling the galaxy? I guess we're just to assume the massive hodgepodge resistance fleet that shows up at the end will eventually take them out too. Anyway, we could certainly have a good debate about Rey's power level in this movie after what's been about a year of training under Leia, who received minimal training herself. But I'd argue lifting several hundred tons of rocks in the previous film was perhaps the most impressive thing we see from Rey in the whole trilogy, mainly because of how easy she makes it look. Even Yoda, lifting less weight, seemed to have some degree of difficulty, and he looked at least a little drained afterwards. Then there was the whole simply closing her eyes and letting the Force thing in that she did in The Force Awakens to easily best Kylo Ren in a saber duel. Though I guess we can now assume maybe it wasn't so much the Force she was letting in, but the spirit of Palpatine and all the Sith or something like that. I do wonder if the other sources of canon will go back to reframe that and other events from the previous two movies. Either way, and for better or worse, I honestly don't know that she was any more powerful than we'd seen her before. Powerful in different ways, certainly, but I don't know that she went to crazy new levels in this film, outside of maybe Force healing, which I would mainly view as powerful because we'd never seen it used before, outside of in The Mandalorian, despite there being plenty of times a Jedi would have used it previously. And at least we do see her having self-doubt in this movie, not to mention failing, giving up, and even losing to Kylo Ren in a saber duel, finally. And there's really no other way to look at their duel on the remains of the second Death Star as anything but a straight up and fair victory for Kylo Ren, and I think it's pretty obvious he would have killed her if not for Leia's interference, which then gave Rey the chance to stab Kylo. But she doesn't let him die, instead she heals him and just leaves him there, telling him she did want to take his hand, but she wanted it to be Ben's hand. And this is done obviously in the hopes that it will begin to finally bring Ben back to the light. She then goes and exiles herself on Ahch-To for like 5 minutes, mainly so we can just get a scene between her and Luke. Overall here, there is a solid and obvious attempt in The Rise of Skywalker to make Rey a more likable and relatable character after The Last Jedi took this character that The Force Awakens had given us in the wrong direction in arguably damn near every respect. Because though there were those who called her a Mary Sue after The Force Awakens, I think many were still waiting to learn more about her before making a final decision, and others were open to having their minds changed if The Last Jedi gave us great explanations. And whether or not it worked here in The Rise of Skywalker, whether or not people liked Rey and the attempt to humanize her a bit is really up to the individual viewer. Also, I don't know that she's truly crazy powerful in this film, mostly because she was rather powerful right out of the box. For better or worse, it all seems about par for the course at this point. Not to mention depowering her unless made part of the plot, or not progressing her skills at all, especially after getting some training now and reading the Jedi books, would have likely felt off. And finally here, her taking on the Skywalker name, for me at least, doesn't have the impact it really should or needed to have if they were going to run with this ending, mainly because this last movie alone had to try and sell us on the idea that she truly bonded with both Luke and Leia. And all they had to do that with to sell us on that is some unused Carrie Fisher footage and one brief scene with Luke on Ahch-To. And so, for a lot of people, that last scene of the whole saga, where she proclaims herself a Skywalker, feels more like a joke or insult than anything else. Well, that's all I've got for you this time. Now it's your turn to tell me how you feel about Rey after The Rise of Skywalker. Did you like the way she was handled or not? Do you like her more or less after this movie? Did you like her taking on the Skywalker name? Whatever you think about any of it, leave a comment below and let's talk some Star Wars. And until next time, thanks for watching.